Hello everybody and welcome to this session number 6, which is going to be for the business research method course, which is going to be about data collection. So how we are going to collect data, what are the instruments for data collection, and what are the process that can be followed in order to get accurate data, which is one of the most important issues in research. As we talked previously, the research is going to be dependent on data, on input. So the input is going to be the data collecting from the field. The process is going to be the methodology and what you are going to do as a researcher. And the output is going to be the findings. So guaranteeing the or to have a good and accurate data in the input process, you are going to guarantee a good findings and accurate data in the findings, and people can depend on. So for this session, the ILOs, or the intended learning outcomes, is going to be the students should be able to, at the end of the session, discuss the data collection process, how they are going to collect the data, and also distinguish between two types of data. We have primary and secondary data. So secondary, which is data collected for other purposes, and primary, the data you are going to collect it as a researcher. And also the students should be able to list advantages and disadvantages of secondary data, so evaluation of the secondary data. These students also should be able to identify different methods of data collection. And accordingly, the session contents is going to be starting with an introduction about the research process and about the data collection, and then we'll take some time discussing the secondary data and the primary data, types of data, and we'll conclude with we'll finish this session with methods of data collection, which is how we are going to collect the data. The data is a collection of facts. This is very important. When we talk about research, we talk about especially the quantitative research. We talk about data collected from the field and analyzed, and then come up with findings and results. So the data is a collection of facts, and it is a value assigned to a thing to know what is data. So either it is a facts collection or a value assigned to something or anything. So the data collection method used by a researcher needs to be objective and systematic, because it is going to be related to collecting accurate data. So why we collect data? The main objective of collecting data is the data must not be influenced by anyone who collects the information. That means objectivity must be there. So data must be collected accurately, as it is the input of any research, and if the input is going to be accurate, of course the output is going to be also accurate, passing the process, of course. The data also collection must be a systematic process, which is the data must be collected in the same way by everyone who is involved in the collection procedure. So it must be also systematic. Now let's talk about the types of data. When we talked about the topics of this session, we talked about two types of data, which is secondary data and primary data. Let's start with the secondary data. The secondary data is data, or are data gathered, recorded by someone else prior to and for the purpose of a purpose other than the current project. So it is data collected for something else, like, for example, financial reports, like census, like any data collecting or used in a research, but it has been collected for another purpose other than the research. It is often historical, because it has been collected previously and the researcher is going to use it for the second time. It has been already assembled. This is always the second characteristic of the secondary data. That means already gathered, analyzed, characterized by somebody else for the purpose of something different from this research, and it needs no access to the subjects because this data has been collected by somebody else who got an access to the subjects and then analyzed it. So the researcher is going to take only the output of this data after the analysis. The secondary data mostly used in some of the business research areas, sometimes in accounting, sometimes also in business administration, because sometimes you don't have a chance to collect primary data, so the solution for that is going to be secondary data. The advantages of the secondary data is the first advantage is obtained rapidly, because it will not take time to collect data from the subjects. That means when I distribute a questionnaire, I might spend a lot of time collecting it back from the respondents. But in the secondary data, it is only getting the ready assembled data, which is in a form of a report or a census or a book or a research. So it is ready and it can be obtained in no time. It is permanent and available. So what you need to do is just go to the source of this data, which is going to be somebody in a company or a library or a data stream, and take it. You will find it available, assembled, analyzed, and so on. It is of course less expensive sometimes. If you go and take a ready-made secondary data, which is in a form of a report, it will not take any cost. There is no cost for that. But if you are going to collect primary data, which is in a form of a questionnaire, or you do an experiment or so on, or a test or whatever, it will take time and it will take also money, or it needs money. One of the advantages of the secondary data also is when the information is not otherwise accessible. In this case, it is going to be an advantage, the secondary data. That means sometimes we cannot collect primary data. There is no chance for collecting primary data in your research. So in this case, the secondary data is going to be a good solution for these cases. Sometimes in some of the information cannot be collected from any company. Some of the topics are sensitive, some of the problems will happen. So in this case, you are going to look for a ready-made or a ready assembled or a secondary data. It's going to be one of the solutions. Secondary data disadvantages is the first disadvantage is uncertain accuracy. Of course, it's you are not going to be certain about the accuracy of this data, because you are not, as a researcher, are not the one who has collected it. Somebody else has collected these types of data, has analyzed this data. We don't know whether he has gone through a scientific scientific research process or not, in terms of the data collection, the data analysis, and come up with the findings. So you are going to take a ready analyze secondary data, and we are not certain about the accuracy. In this case, if you got an access, if you find somebody or get an access to the main source of this data and ask them about the methodology of the data collection and analysis or the assembling of this data, it is going to be better to ask them how they have collected the data, how they have analyzed it, and how the output is come out. The second disadvantage of the secondary data is that data not consistent with the needs most of the time. You cannot find data that can fit the objectives, the research objectives and the research problem 100%, because as we said at the beginning, these types of data has been collected for something else and for different objectives other than your objectives. The third point is that inappropriate units of measurement. We don't know whether they use the people who has assembled this data have used appropriate units of measurement or not. So as I said, if there is a chance to go and find out, to go to the source of this data and find out how they have measured the phenomena in this report, is going to be better, and it's a good process. The fourth point of the disadvantages of the secondary data is that time period inappropriate. It might be dated. Talking, for example, about the economic census in the USA, there is an economic census published every 5 years. So these 5 years, if for example the latest version of this census has been published 3 years ago, so it is still effective, it is still the latest one, but for me as a researcher it is dated, because a lot of problems, economic problems, happened in the world or in the country, which is going to be different from time to time, from year to year, but the latest data is going to be for the last 5 years. It is still 2 years effective, but it is 3 years ago, so in this case it is going to be dated. Sometimes the financial reports, sometimes when we work in a research about the financial management, for example, on an accounting or whatever, we might depend on financial statements and financial reports. These reports sometimes delayed. It's not going to be published at the end of the year. It might be published in the second year or at the end of the second year. And in this case, I'm talking about something dated because of the change in the market and change in the financial market might have a lot of differences about my data. The secondary data types, we have a lot of types. One of these examples is the economic census. As I said, the American economic census. It has started in 1957. The economic census profiled the U.S. economy every 5 years from the national to the local level. Okay, how I can evaluate the secondary data? So if I am forced to use secondary data, I need first to evaluate them, to evaluate these types of data for the purpose of making sure that it is fitting my research problem and my objectives, and also double check the accuracy of these types of data. So I have two criteria of evaluation. The first one is whether the secondary data is applicable to the project objectives. So the applicability to project objectives or the current project objectives. So I must answer these questions. These questions are going to give me an answer whether it is the secondary data can be applicable to my research objective or not. First one is, does the data help to answer questions set out the problem in the problem definition? So does it fit my problem, research problem? Does it answer the research questions or not? So when I say yes, that means the data is applicable. When I say no, that means it is not applicable and I cannot use it. The second question is, does the data apply to the time period of interest or not? This is very, very important. So the time period, whether it is equivalent or suitable to the time of the current research or not, and this is very, very important. Does the data apply to the population of interest or not? This is also very, very important. So whether the data applicable to the population of my research as a researcher or the current research is very important. If not, that means I cannot use it. It's not applicable. Another question about applicability, which is do the other terms and variable classifications presented apply or not? This is very important question. So the variable classification presented in this secondary data can match my variables or not. The last question for applicability is, are the units of measurements comparable or not? That means if I collect primary data, am I going to use a similar measurements or different measurements? This is also very, very important. The second criteria of evaluating the secondary data is checking the accuracy of the data, which is very important. Most of the time when we talk about data collection, we say the data is the input. So if the data is accurate, the input is accurate, the output, which is the findings of this research, is going to be also accurate. Again, we ask some questions to check or double check the accuracy of the data. The first one, of course, is if possible, go to the original source of the data. This is very, very important, and I talked about it just a minute ago. So if there is a chance for the researcher to go to the original source and check the data and find out the way they have collected the data, if it's scientific, accurate, I can go ahead. Otherwise, I will not use it because it is not accurate. The second question is the cost of the data acquisition worth it? Sometimes I pay some money, especially when I take data from data stream. In the data stream, in a database called data stream, I might pay some money, especially when I'm looking for reports of the listed companies in the stock market. I might pay some money. So if the cost worth it, okay. If the cost doesn't worth, I have to go to the primary data unless otherwise problems and situation will appear. Is there a possibility of bias? This is very important, and you must, as a researcher, you should go and double check the possibility of bias. If there is the data accuracy, and find out if there is a bias. Sometimes in some of the companies the report is not accurate, so of course it's going to be an input for my research, and it's going to make a lot of problems. Can the accuracy of data collection be verified? It is very important to ask this question. So if the accuracy of the data collection can be verified, this is helpful to the researcher. That means I will make sure whether I can find the data or not. In common research objectives for the secondary data studies, there are a lot of objectives and common objectives, research objectives for the secondary data. The fact finding, I can use secondary data. Identifying consumption patterns, so I will go to previous studies, previous work, and find out, and then come up with new approaches, patterns by the analysis of these studies. Tracking a trend or trends, so follow up trend. That means taking reports and then tracking the differences between the reports over time. Model building, so estimating the market potential. This is also one of the objectives that can be fulfilled by collecting secondary data. Forecasting sales also, and doing what we call in statistics modeling. forecast the sales for the next years, depending on the sales of the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. Selecting trade areas and sites also is going to be dependent on some of the reports. So these are also some of the other objectives for secondary data studies, like fact finding, identifying customer behavior, trend analysis, and also environmental scanning, which I have just talked about. Now, there are 2 types of secondary data. We have internal secondary data, and we have also external secondary data. Talking about internal secondary data, that means we are talking about data collected by the researcher from his company, or the company he is working in, from a company he is working in, and taken the data from the units or the departments in that company. So internal and proprietary data is more descriptive, and it is taken from the units of the company that the researcher is working in. So it's like accounting information. You go to the financial unit and take some accounting information. Sales information, the researcher in the company can go to the sales manager and take a report about the sales. And also the customer complaints, marketing officer can also provide a lot of reports like that. The external data, or the external secondary data, is data created, recorded, and generated by an entity other than the researcher's organization. So somebody else has create, record, generate the data, and then the researcher is going to take it from him, and there is no any relationship between the researcher between the researcher and this entity. So like government, trade association, a newspaper and journal, libraries, the internet, vendors and producers, and also book and periodicals. So this is everything about the secondary data, which is one of the types of the data collected from the field. The second type of data is primary data. The primary data is the opposite of the secondary data. It is data, according to Zekman, he said that data that is gathered, assembled specifically for the purpose of the research project at hand. So the researcher himself design an instrument and go to the field, collected from the subjects or the respondents the data himself. So it's first-hand data. That means it has been collected for the purpose of your research as a researcher, and the instrument has been built and has been prepared for that purpose. You are going to get the data yourself and nobody else. As a researcher, you are going to assemble and also analyze this data. It is also information obtained first-hand by the researcher on the variables of interest for the specific purposes or purpose of study, and this is according to Sikaran 2003. The primary data can be taken using a lot of instruments. When we talk about the types of research, we talked about qualitative and quantitative. So there are some instruments which is going to be helpful in qualitative, and it's instruments of data collection for qualitative method, and also for quantitative there are other types of research, so instruments. So for qualitative we use focus group discussion to collect data, gather 7 to 8 subjects, and then we discuss the issue, and then we can have a moderator to take notes, and we come up with the data. Or interviews, whether it is going to be a peer interview or a personal interview. The observation, whether it is going to be using the checklist or it can be by videotaping. And the questionnaires, which is going to be also a data collection tool used in quantitative data. And I think most of the business administration researchers used the quantitative, and most of them they use the questionnaire. And also they can use also the qualitative data collection instruments. The experiments also is a quantitative data tool, data collection tool. The primary data, when we talk about primary data, that means we are talking about surveys. We are talking about means of collecting data. So the survey is a research technique in which information or data are collected through questionnaire interviews from a sample of people or respondents. This according to Karen. So a research technique in which information or data collected through the tools of data collection, which I have just explained. So surveys ask respondents for information using verbal or written questioning, and also it is a communication between the researcher and the respondents for the purpose of collecting data. So in the primary data, the respondents are a representative sample of the people, because sometimes the population is going to be a very big number. So the researcher is going to take a sample and start collecting data from that sample. We gather information via surveys, as I have just explained. So when we gather the information via surveys, it's advantageous because it might be inexpensive. I can distribute the survey and collect it in short time. It's going to be efficient because it will match the objective or fulfill your objective, and you can build the tool or the research tool according to the research problem. Of course, it's going to be much more accurate than the secondary data, because the researcher is going to supervise the data collection and ensure the accuracy of this data. It's going to be flexible. If there is any problem, I can go back and collect the data again. It's not just like the secondary data, which is only the one choice, either it is okay or not okay. When we talk also about primary data, we talk about the types of research according to the period for the surveys. We have two types, which is cross-sectional, in which you collect the data once, either in 1 week or in 1 month or even in 6 months, but you just collect the data only once. Or longitudinal, in which you follow a case, or you collect the data from the same subject several times and then compare the development or the deterioration of any issue or phenomena. So the cross-sectional study is a study in which various segments of population are sampled. The most important issue here is that data are collecting at a single moment in time. So we collect the data only once. When we talk about the longitudinal study, as I said, it's a survey of respondents at different times. So I collect the data in different times, thus allowing the analysis of changes over time. So if I want to know the differences between the employees' job performance, let's say, this year and last year and the year before. So I have 3 years. So I will collect the data in the 3 years, and then I just compare, because I'm following or tracking the study. They call it tracking study or following cases. So compare trends and identify changes. But when I talk about the cross-sectional, that means if I'm doing research about job performance, so I am going to collect the data only ones. So customer satisfaction, for example, is also another example for the longitudinal or cross-sectional data collection. So the customer satisfaction can be also followed the changes or tracked, or I can track the changes in the customer satisfaction during several times. So either monthly or annual or yearly or in different years, and then I will just compare between what we have and what we got. So this is everything about the secondary the data and the types of the data for this session, which is the 6th session. So through this session, I'm sure that you have learned discussing the data collection process, how we can collect the data and what are the types of data collection and the techniques, and also distinguishing between primary and secondary data, and listing advantages and disadvantages of secondary data, and finally identifying different methods of data collection. This is what we have talked about in this session. The assignment is going to be attached and uploaded in the LMS for this session. Now we come to the end of this session, which was about the data collection process. So we have talked about different types of data, the secondary data, and how we can evaluate the secondary data so it can fit our research problem and our objectives and can answer the research questions. And also we have talked also about another type of data, which is the primary data, and we concluded that, or we recommend that most of the researchers they have to go for primary data, and if they can't for some research problems, they go for the secondary, because the primary data is the one that can suit and fit your research objectives. We also talked about the methods of data collection, and I hope everything is clear to you, and see you in the next session. Thank you for listening and for watching this session. Thank you very much. Thank you.